I'm here in St. Paul, and I'm a native New Yorker, so I tend to talk fast, and I've been asked to slow down a bit, so I'm going to do the best I can to help the translators. It's a great pleasure to be here at Science for the People. There's some aspect of returning to home to it. My parents, Deborah and Roderick Wallace, helped set up Scientists and Engineers for Social and Political Action about the same time that Richard Levins and colleagues set up Science for the People out in Boston. And there was, as I hear, some aspect of rivalry between those groups. And maybe that's a good sign when you have enough radicals, radical scientists around to actually have that kind of rivalry. Although I imagine the old joke along the lines of that, get one radical scientist in a room and that's enough for an argument to start. So, but I'll say this, what I'm going to do today, and start off with something of a kind of where we are now in terms of a kind of a little digest through some of the things that I've been keeping my eye on in the last couple of weeks. Then I'll go through to how we got here, talk a little bit about the book along the way, and maybe along the way I'll talk about what might be happening next. And then finally talk a little bit about pandemic research for the people. So just to start us off.
Sorry, could you go a little slower?
A little slower, okay.
Yes,
okay,
thank you.
I'm trying, okay. Thirsty word. The Johns Hopkins website shows us today at about 116 million cases from the beginning of the outbreak, and we're at 2.5 million deaths. Both those things might be undercounts in some ways. On the other hand, The Atlantic had an article a couple of days ago declaring war is over. Now that we have the vaccine, then we should wrap this up in short order. Never mind that 130 countries out there don't have a single dose. But, it does, speak to kind of the split personality the left has to have. And that on the one hand, we very much are, very much always have been fighting for the right and access to the latest medical technology for everyone. And on the other hand, we're always fighting for the right to try to shift, keep health problems from emerging in the first place. It's a split because in essence, there's an aspect of presently the use of the vaccine as an excuse to stop discussing how we got here in the first place. So, I'd say, yes, the vaccine is good news. If you have an opportunity to get it, do get it, please. But I think we must very much fight for the right of people around the world, certainly in the global south, to have access to it. But in addition, there's souths all over the place, including within the country. There's the South Bronx, there's the South Side of Chicago, there's South LA, South Philadelphia. And Black and brown people were suffering the worst in terms of the disease outcomes and exposure. And we have an obligation to push back and make sure that they get into the front of the line in terms of access, considering the damage that comes in. On the other hand, things aren't so good either, in the sense of we've learned things in the last couple of months that kind of make things problematic in terms of our sense of just tying this off. Alexis Dino and Jarvis Chen at Harvard did a kind of back of the envelope calculation that basically showed that the case fatality rates aren't just this 1% thing. You have these long haulers who are infected for months. So after the first hospitalization, they go home and suffer, and some of them actually succumb to their infection. There's one source of additional damage that hasn't been brought to the fore as much as it should. Lewis, even the very notion of herd immunity is not maybe what we think it is. Lewis Bass's group looked at COVID antibodies in blood samples from what was largely an uncontrolled outbreak in Manaus in northern Brazil. And even though they were clocking in at 76% infected by October, you still had the infection raging on. I mean, there's a variety of explanations, maybe an overstated attack rate, maybe because immunity wanes, maybe because But the lesson to draw out of is that this magical number we have in our head, 75%, may actually not be something that actually we can pin our hopes and dreams on, and that different populations may have different versions of a herd immunity. So that on clarity, it muddies the waters enough that the sense of we just have to get to this number in terms of natural infections or even vaccinations. Again, it might be a little bit more complicated than that. So the other thing that comes to mind, of course, is since Biden's come to office, we do have a sense that there's more of a plan in action. But even with Trump out of office, the absurdities continue to emerge. Biden explained that Black and brown people had less access to vaccines because they didn't use the internet as much or didn't know how to use it. Never mind, of course, that the U.S. continues not to engage in the kind of contact tracing and community outreach and community health campaigns necessary to outreach to people and bring the vaccines to them. Of course, there's the disaster of Cuomo, New York, covering for the elderly homes and covering for his donors. There's Lightfoot in Chicago, who used $281 million of COVID money to pay for police. And of course, we have Texas and Mississippi opening up. And so, it isn't just merely a matter of Trumpism, as much as we all should be glad that he's gone. But I think in my mind, these are all very much markers of a kind of imperial decline. So how do we get to this? And this is what primarily the book's about. I finished it in July, so there is some aspect of it not getting to some of the things that have happened since. But it does, well, let's start off with the title of the book. It's called Dead Epidemiologists. Why is it called that? I was inspired by a book by Jeff Vandermeer, the science fiction writer. He has a book called Dead Astronauts, in which 3 sort of astronauts are in a position to try to save a version of Earth from itself, as it were. So that's a good connotation to it, and that even in the difficulties they go through, they continue to do that. But my connotation was a more negative one. It doesn't mean that epidemiologists are dead in the sense of they're not good people or aren't doing good work. Many of them are incredibly brave and bright and brilliant beyond belief. But unfortunately, a goodly portion of the establishment epidemiology is ensconced in some of the premises of empire and the very processes that led to the emergence of the pathogen in the first place. So it also harks back to Marxist notions of dead peasants, that even the dead are used as a means by which capital accumulates. So those are some of the connotations involved. But it's that second one that comes to the fore in terms of what epidemiologists' role in this. And I didn't plan on writing them into this. It's just that in the course of writing a lot about COVID over the past year, I kept coming across statements and declarations and assumptions by world-class epidemiologists that were not supported in any way, shape, or form. All sorts of people were taken into account in the book. I do name names for better and for worse in that way, because it doesn't bend well for a career. But even some of the heroes of this terrible moment that has led to 500,000 deaths, if one can call them heroes, they've been treated that way, come in for a kind of critique. So Anthony Fauci, for instance, has a long history going back to spearheading Ronald Reagan's efforts on AIDS. And of course, he has a very, there's an aspect, he's very politic, and we can maybe perhaps see that as a means by which to protect government science against political interference. But time and again, and this has been very well documented in the social science literature, Fauci has in essence accepted the deepest and darkest premises of empire and internal colonization to, in essence, protect the system that drives diseases that are emerging left and right. So one of the things that our group has converged on is that we've been taking radical critiques of outbreaks since H5N1 emerged in Guangdong, Southeast Asia, the turn of the century, first celebrity virus of the new century. And we've had regular outbreaks of different kinds of pathogens emerging almost on the annual. So we had SARS-1, we had H7N9, we have MERS, we had Ebola out of West Africa, we have Ebola again in the Congo, we have the Zika, and they're all very different pathogens for sure. And although many of them are RNA viruses, some of them come out of some of the same host types, bats for Ebola and the coronaviruses. But for the most part, they're different in many ways, and we can lose sight of things if we are, in essence, driven to the computer each time there's an outbreak, and it's kind of morbid fascination to look up their molecular biologies, their clinical courses, their epidemiologies. And we should do that, of course. But what our group has done is that we've kind of used each one of these outbreaks to kind of update our notions of how these pathogens are emerging. And we've kind of, in our view, kind of put in a final piece, coronavirus, the SARS-2 here, the virus that causes COVID-19, allowed us to do this, and we've kind of converged on something of a model about what's going on. And in a word, it's global capitalism. It's having a profound effect on the various reservoir species that have typically been marginalized to the hinterlands and into forests. And in the course of engaging in the kind of deforestation development that's driven by multinational agriculture, by logging, by mining, it strips out the complexity of the forest, reduces the kind of environmental stochasticity that keeps the pathogen from lining up a whole bunch of hosts, increases the interface between the hosts and the locals, and then spills its way out into a regional capital before getting on a plane. So our vision of it is something of a kind of a circuit of production, and that circuit of production is reproduced all around the world in different contexts. So, West Africa, we called it the neoliberal Ebola, because as those countries are subjected to kind of structural adjustment programs that lead to the decline in public health, opens up the economy to multinationals coming in. And so what were previously indigenous and smallholder systems and agroforestry are suddenly swept aside, and forests that were, the kind of canopy agriculture that had been done previously is wiped aside in favor of kind of sun plantations that in essence will kill many a host species, but also along the way, some of the host species exhibit considerable behavioral plasticity. They have the capacity to change their behavior in a way that allows them to survive. So bats, many of the frugivore bats, fruit-eating bats, many of the insectivore bats have a capacity to change their behavior. And so once their forest declines, they've been documented to migrate to these new monoculture plantations, palm oil, and macadamia and such. And what's not to like about it? There's a lot of room between the few predators, there's few competitors, a lot of room between their foraging and roosting sites. And of course, there's an increasing interface with the humans that are tending the plantations or the livestock that have been brought in. Because locals have been stripped of their access and control of land, many indigenous and smallholders are moving to the city to find work. They also move back during the planting season to help the family. So we have a kind of cycle migration that's occurring. So in essence, these pathogens develop a straight shot between spilling over at the forest edge into humans there who migrate to the city. And so in part, in our mind, the change in causality isn't merely a matter of whether or not Ebola changed its genetics or its clinical course. It did not. It's pretty much the same from what was circulating since 1976, minor changes, of course. But the changes in the field in terms of how social organizations come about, which is in essence, in this case, imposed upon the global south by the global north. And so these pathogens, which were previously marginalized, suddenly find themselves in a different context, which speaks to their strengths in terms of being able to line up whole different types of other animal species, including humans, and then take a straight shot into your regional capital. So Ebola is an example of some of the diseases that are spilling over at the forest edge. Other diseases are spilling over at the other end of that circuit of production. So a lot of the avian influenzas, the swine influenzas are emerging out of large mega farms of hundreds of thousands of genetically similar livestock and poultry that are more near the peri-urban circle around cities. So that's H1N1 2009 at Mexico City is an example of that. Our group called it the NAFTA flu after the North American Free Trade Agreement. You see, we're not doing what Obama demanded us to do, which is to call it H1N1. We are defining it by trying to show that this larger political context, this larger political economy, has an impact on the evolution of the pathogens in the first place. Other pathogens are evolving along that circuit of production. So you have pathogens like Zika and the SARS, which are emerging along that way. And so our vision of it is that SARS-2 emerged in China in part by virtue of the fact that China engaged in the kind of BRICS road of capitalist development. It's not for me to say whether it's the way to go, it's their decision, but in essence, they chose to do capitalism with Chinese characteristics. Better to keep the Americans and Europeans out from exploiting their own resources. China would exploit its own resources, moving millions out of poverty, also leaving millions behind. But in the course of doing so, engaging in the kind of deforestation that I described. Since SARS-1, a lot of work by the Chinese epidemiologists and ornithologists, not ornithologists, but bat scientists, although they're working birds as well. But they've been, in essence, just tracking the different types of SARS-like coronaviruses, and they're splattered all across southern and central China. So those pathogens are in constant competition or evolution and adaptation to the bat immune system, which is top-notch as immune system goes. It's one of the only mammals that flies. So it has to be healthy. So you have a high basal temperature. You've got all sorts of other mechanisms that, in essence, selects for increasing virulence, increasing deadliness in the in the coronaviruses and the other pathogens, including Ebola, within bats. So as deforestation happens, you again have the increasing interface between the bats and not only humans, but the livestock and the wild food system in China. That is, we have an increasing industrialization of wild animals for food production and in medicine in such a way that it increases the, we have all sorts of coronaviruses that are splattering across different species. And, there is an aspect of that when you are able to work with a host populations numbering in the millions or hundreds of thousands, and you have in essence a laboratory of many years. Some of the genomics indicate that the SARS-2 was actually circulating long years before Wuhan within humans. And so that you have the chance to experiment to get up to the point that you can make your way and become a human to human and something of a new celebrity virus, as it were, as you make your way out of Wuhan, and of course the rest is history from there. So that's the main thing that comes out of that. I mean, the book is full of all sorts of observations all over the place to try to get at some sort of grasp of what's going on. Pathogens, outbreaks, pandemics are somewhat mirrors of our present society. And we can see some countries were capable of responding to the outbreak for a variety of reasons. They doesn't have to do with access to vaccines, although of course vaccine is a good idea, as I said. But we have countries like as politically different as Vietnam and New Zealand that were capable of stopping the outbreak from happening without a vaccine or antivirals. And it has to do with their social organization. The notion that governance should be organized around, in part, helping the people, rather than, and this gets to the neoliberal paradigm, which is just about straight up robbery. Britain and the US, to use the world systems theorist notions of things, are on the far side of their cycle of accumulation. They're in the business of churning capital back to money. In other words, that's a way of saying they're cashing out. And so the last 40 years in which public health here in the US and Britain was in essence either neglected or sold off. And so notions of public health involved your personal relationship with your doctor in such a way that, if you have insurance, and even under Obamacare, we have something like 28 million Americans who don't have insurance, 44 million Americans that are underinsured. And that's the basis of our intervention for that. So it isn't just the horror of Trump. Most definitely it is that. But in addition, it's woven into a particular historical nexus that these countries have found themselves in. And in order to make sure that something like this doesn't happen again, we're going to have to push back on a number of fronts. And I'm sure that's something that Joseph and I can get into if that's what we wish to talk about. I'm not sure how I'm doing for time, but I'm going to wrap up on what I said. We'll talk a little bit about pandemic research for the people and what that is. Coming out in March and April, when we realized that in essence, we all realized that we in essence have been abandoned by the system here in the US and elsewhere. It's not just Trump in the office, it's just, and in addition, there were, to hark back to our dead epidemiologists, just straight up wrong answers. And on one hand, it's okay in the sense of at the early outbreak, we don't know everything about it. That's understandable. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm just talking about the straight up gangster hubris involved when China announced that, in fact, you could get infected, pass on infection before symptoms. You had many epidemiologists here in the US who scoffed at that. Michael Osterholm, of course, is one. It doesn't bode well if you so presume that SARS-2 would be the same as SARS-1 and MERS. An RNA virus couldn't possibly evolve toward a new, life history model, as if somehow the virus is supposed to be following our memos from the establishment epidemiology. So we decided that we needed some intervention, and that notions of that, how are we going to deal with some of the very real problems that everyday people are facing. So Pandemic Research for the People, it's a project of the Agroecology and Rural Economics Research Corps. It's comprised of several working groups. And we got together on Zoom and such to have conversations about what to do about things. Prep Neighborhoods deals with some urban issues. Prep Rural with the problems that rural communities face. Prep Agroecologies is discussing whether or not there can be agricultures that would preclude such pathogens from emerging in the first place. And these are, yes, there are scientists on board. There are natural scientists, there are social scientists, but there are all sorts of community members on there as well, in such a way that, and everybody comes to the table as very much an equal. This is not about any scientism. This is about practicing good hearing and listening. This is about being humble. Sometimes it doesn't always work. Sometimes there are bumps in the road, but there's a real attempt to try to integrate expertise. And it's not just in any literature. It's about everyday experience. And it's about getting people together to kind of work through some of the issues and some of solutions. The working groups then will, in essence, print out dispatches on a particular topic as a way of opening discussion and, in essence, signaling everyday people that they have a right to participate in their well-being, and they have a right to engage in a discussion over what's going on and what we can do about it. So that is Pandemic Research for the People. And it's been going on for almost a year now, and we have a few dispatches on their way. From prep neighborhoods, we have a dispatch on the outbreak in LA as it relates to housing and racism. Prep Rural has a dispatch on the way on exiting the kind of the racist agricultural economy, and how to get farmers of color and younger farmers back on the land, and reintroducing a different kind of agriculture. And then Prep Agroecologies is in the middle of interrogating what even our concepts of land involve, and how even the notion of land comes with all sorts of presumptions about ownership and social relations. So that's what we're up to. Please join us. Take a look around over at prepthepeople.net. And that's it, all I have to say today. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rob. Joe, before I hand it to you and Rob, I just wanted to make an announcement regarding Spanish interpretation. We are having a little bit of technical issue with Jitsi. So what we're going to try and do is, Joe, after you ask a question, Joel, our interpreter, will repeat that in Spanish. And then Rob, when you answer in English, every few sentences, Joel, if you could pause, Joel would interpret that. Thank you for your help.
Okay, thank you, Nafeek. Okay. Before I post questions directly to Rob, I'm going to make a few comments to sort of set the stage for the conversation. And for those of you that can see the virtual image behind me, it's of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King at the March on Washington. And this is shortly after Malcolm said concerning the RFK assassination that he was never surprised when chickens came home to roost. Now, after reading Rob's book, it became really apparent to me that ways that I was thinking about the spiraling cascade into infectious disease organisms that was occurring in the world was directly the result of the system that had created the conditions for which this would occur. Now, if anyone is in any way troubled by my way of thinking about this, then you can blame John Vandermeer, who was the one who actually taught me how to think this way. And this is not just in the case of infectious materials. It's in virtually every aspect of the way capitalism works. It simply has, and it only has ever had, one purpose, and that is to appropriate the labor of working people and turn that into the wealth and well-being of those in the ruling classes. And that's exactly what it does. And it does so in the most horrific ways, in which, the pandemics that have occurred throughout history are just one of those ways. And it's done so with regard to, global catastrophes in the form of war. During the nuclear arms race between the Soviet Union and the United States, there were several times that nuclear Armageddon was simply avoided by blind, dumb luck. And that's because that's the way that system works. That's the way the underlying dynamics had to operate. Now, I'm going to say one more thing in this regard.
Pardon me, Professor?
Yes?
Pardon me, Professor. I just want to offer the interpretation.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay. Primeramente, antes de empezar las preguntas, quisiera pues ubicarnos. Lo que ustedes pueden ver detrás de mí en la pantalla es una foto de Malcolm X y Martin Luther King Jr. Cuando estaban en la marcha de Washington. Siempre ha dicho Malcolm X que él no se sorprendió cuando los pollos vuelven a casa para descansar. Eso también está vinculado a lo que estamos discutiendo en ese momento. El capitalismo siempre ha tenido un solo propósito. Eso es extraer el labor de las clases trabajantes y trasladarlo a las clases gobernantes. Y yo creo que eso también está vinculado a lo que estamos viviendo en estos momentos con la explosión de los virus. Y eso es algo que pues ustedes pueden poner la culpa en el que me enseñó eso, Jan van der Meer.
Okay, thank you very much for that translation. The last point I'm going to make before I start directing some questions directly to Ross is that one of the things that we've found historically with regard to this terror that this economic system must generate is that terror is differentially visited upon the lives and bodies of Black and brown people throughout the world. That's why I wrote the piece for Science for the People online magazine, Their Money, Our Lives. Very early on during the pandemic, it was apparent, even before data were available, that Black and brown people were dying or were first getting sick and dying at greater rates. Now, I was on national television early on in the pandemic in late February in 2020, and I kept making that point. I kept making the point that since we know, based upon the history of disease in particularly the United States, that these communities are going to be hit hardest, and therefore it was necessary to immediately be proactively working to help those communities, to give them means to be able to survive the pandemic that was coming. And of course, those pleas fell upon deaf ears, and I do this over and over again. So anyway, you might want to translate that, and then I'll start asking questions to Rob.
Thank you. Históricamente hemos visto que el capitalismo es un sistema que siempre aterroriza a las comunidades negras y morenas. Y al inicio de la pandemia vimos que los que padecían inicialmente a lo máximo de la coronavirus fueron esas comunidades. Por eso escribí un artículo en el jornal Science for the People en línea, Their Money, Our Lives, su dinero, nuestras vidas, para hablar de eso. Y yo creo que siempre suplicando que me oyen sobre eso, lamentablemente eso cayó sobre las orejas sordas. Siempre en toda la historia de las maldades, los que están impactados al máximo son esas comunidades, y por eso siempre pedí que hagamos un impulso proactivo para esas comunidades, para protegerles, para que pudieran sobrevivir la pandemia.
All right, Rob. One of the things that came up during your presentation was the ineptness of the Trump regime's response to the COVID pandemic. I'd like you to address the question of, and this is something that I've thought the entire time, that in fact, their lack of the plan was their plan.
Yes, and there are aspects of conscious decision making on their part, and incompetence, and also structurally imposed or structurally accumulated damage to the country by virtue of neglect and the kind of cashing
But
out.
if you do that with wood, it just goes out.
There's
Yeah.
so there's
Well,
there is the aspect of clearly, I think the Trump administration came in on the basis of in essence, engage in the kind of strip mining that they wanted to do and just take the money and for themselves. So there's a corrupt gangsterism aspect of it. There is, of course, the utter incompetence on their part too. Trump himself, they were not in essence in any way trained in the terrible arts of American governance. So in essence, their notion of what, the American first aspect of it was in some sense a retreat for America, in the sense that post-World War II, the US was supposed to, in essence, run the entire global capitalist system for bourgeoisie around the world. And that has been going on since World War II across administrations. He refused that. So we backed out of WHO. We backed out of CDC's role in helping staunch outbreaks that the capitalist system was selecting for. So there is, of course, the entire aspect of refusing to hire 700 CDC members. There's the withdrawing out of China in terms of having our eyes on the ground in terms of the epidemiology. So I would agree to your point that it's on purpose in the sense of backtracking out of governance as something that could help people. It's conscious in the sense of the desire to use governance to enrich themselves. And then, of course, as I described earlier, there was the 40 years of neoliberalism that got us to a point where we were, even if Biden was in office, or even if Hillary had won, we would have been in some considerable danger still. Even Biden in office now, he promised 100,000 contact tracers, which aren't even anywhere near enough in favor of a kind of vaccine approach. And so, he has us all to be inoculated adults by May. It's good. But in addition, there's so much more that's necessary to, as other countries have demonstrated, to stop an outbreak.
Okay, pardon me.
Sorry
I'd like
about that.
to offer a summary. Disculpas, una summarización de la primera pregunta. La primera pregunta viniendo del Dr. Graves. Durante la charla de Rob, él nos presentó el concepto de que con la administración de Trump hubo ineptitud, pero que la ineptitud de Trump fue a propósito, que eso no fue algo que solamente surgió como decían otros, de solamente una persona sin inteligencia haciendo este oficio. La contexta de Rob es que sí, la administración Trump hubo un aspecto de ineptitud, pero de verdad eso fue parte de una estrategia de a cielo, de enriquecer a los que fue sus apoyantes, y también que eso está atado a lo que es la historia de los Estados Unidos después de la Guerra Mundial, la Segunda Guerra Mundial, y de 40 años de neoliberalismo. También introduce Rob el concepto de que también con la Organización Mundial de la Salud, eso fue algo que rechazó Trump, que eso también fue vinculado a lo que es un sistema de enriquecer a las clases gubernales, y que eso también conlleva lo que es la brote de la virus, y que también eso es algo que todavía estamos sufriendo durante la administración de Biden, porque también él ha prometido cosas como 100,000 personas que van a ayudar como contact tracers, o los que van a ayudar con el descubrimiento de la coronavirus, y que eso también no es algo que será suficiente, que todavía estamos hablando de cómo el capitalismo conviene a la maldad.
To be sure, Trump is a mass murderer with hundreds of thousands of lives on his hands, for sure. I want to be very clear about that.
Y también, para estar claro, Trump sí es un asesino que tiene la sangre de millones sobre sus manos.
And before I go on to my next question for Rob, I am going to make the comment that I think that Trump also saw the pandemic as the perfect tool for voter suppression, particularly since it was impacting Black and brown communities more, and he had convinced his own followers that the virus didn't actually exist.
Y también voy a hacer el comentario que Trump vio a la virus como una herramienta para la supresión de los votantes, especialmente en las comunidades negras y morenas, y diciendo que también Trump sabía que sus apoyantes no creyeron y que existió la virus. Y eso es algo que no quiero que perdamos.
Okay, Rob, I would like you to talk more, particularly for people who haven't read your book yet, about your critique of the One Health initiative with regard to its role in actually facilitating the conditions that lead to pandemics.
Yes.
Okay, Rob, quisiera que usted hable sobre el fallo de la iniciativa One Health, y también que eso es algo que ayuda a la pandemia que está surgiendo.
Sure. When H5N1 emerged in China in '97, it really freaked a lot of people out because it was the first virus that spilled directly from poultry into humans and was clocking in at case fatality rates of 60% and more. And so it scared enough governments to get scientists from across the board to sit down and work together. So they came up with this notion, it's an old notion, but it's now new. It's an old notion that the health of animals, wildlife, livestock, and humans and the environment are integrated. And so you have to have people in each of those fields sit together and talk to each other and work out solutions. And on its face, it's exactly on point. And it should be that way. And I was, when I was doing contract work for the Food and Agriculture Organization, I was part of some of those meetings. I became, I moved away from that in part because I realized what was happening, and that you have factions in One Health who were using the idea to, in essence, blame indigenous groups and smallholders for the outbreak, for any of these outbreaks that were emerging. And so they would focus on the region in which a new virus would spill over. So let's go, to Guinea and in West Africa, on that border region with Liberia, and they would blame indigenous groups who might take down a stand of trees. And so the focus was what is called absolute geographies, the coordinates, the GPS coordinates where the actual outbreak happens. So there's a lot of focus on what was going on at that GPS coordinates. Our group moved away from that. We're in favor of more what's called structural One Health. We're more interested in the big picture. We're more interested in what are called relational geographies, that something on one side of the world affects something on the other side. And so our vision of it is that the worst disease hotspots are cities like New York City, London, and Hong Kong, because these are the centers of capital that is funding the deforestation that drive and development that leads to the spillover events in the first place. And so what a lot of the One Health groups are doing, and one of them is the EcoHealth Alliance, and right there in New York City, it's an NGO that takes a lot of money from Colgate-Palmolive and Johnson & Johnson, and has a $40 million from DOD. And so they're in essence taking money and greenwashing companies who basically washing their hands of blame for the emergence of these outbreaks in the first place. So there's a political economy to the research itself. That has spilled over into COVID itself. If we remember a couple of weeks ago, the WHO went to investigate the possible origins of COVID-19 in China. Well, part of that group was Peter Daszak, who was the president of the EcoHealth Alliance. In essence, EcoHealth Alliance took money, basically not only engaged in the kind of ecology that's necessary to see how pathogens emerge, but you were using money to, in essence, develop gain of function studies, which are studies in which you allow the virus to run through a bunch of hosts in a lab and to evolve toward virulence on its own. There's really no good reason to do that. It's a very dangerous thing to do. And although I am a proponent of the field hypothesis of COVID's emergence, that it came out from emerging from deforestation, there's another hypothesis called the lab leak hypothesis, that the virus emerged out of the Wuhan lab. There's a lot of conspiracy theories about it. I don't agree with those. But the notion that the EcoHealth Alliance were working with the Wuhan group, and you don't have the person heavily involved in that on your WHO team investigating the origins of the virus. So even though I reject lab leak, it was in essence something of a stitch up. So what I'm getting at, to make a long story long, I apologize, is that you have ecologists and epidemiologists who are foundationally involved in propping up the system that brought up the damage in the first place. And there's a lot of money to be made as an epidemiologist or an ecologist to, in essence, support and clean up this mess in favor of the system that are selecting for these pathogens.
En pregunta la segunda, o en contesta, perdón, la segunda pregunta, que es una pregunta sobre por qué ha cambiado Rob su mente sobre la iniciativa One Health. Explica que existe una economía política donde eso ayuda a los cientistas a poder ganar mucho dinero de apoyar un sistema que conllevó a las maldades que están intentando resolver. Primeramente, como ejemplo, en 1997, la virus H5N1 que surgió en China, eso fue un caso que realmente fue algo muy impactante y llamativo, porque ese virus tenía una fatalidad de 60% en los casos. Por eso fue algo que dio pavor a los gobiernos y algo que también llevó a cambiar de mente hacia una noción, una idea que de verdad es algo muy anciano, pero ha surgido de nuevo. Es que los animales, los seres humanos y los que trabajan en la salud pública tienen que todos estar en conversación para solucionar esa clase de problema. También Rob comentó que cuando estaba trabajando con el Ministerio de Comida y Agricultura, que también durante unas reuniones él vio que lamentablemente muchos se culpaban a los grupos indígenas. Los grupos indígenas en las tierras donde descubrieron esas pandemias y esos virus. También como ejemplo, él habla de lo que pasó en el oeste de África con la gente Diné, que también ellos se culparon para hacer cosas como cortar los árboles para su bienestar. Y lo que está diciendo que es hacer culpable las víctimas de los que están sufriendo algo que está vinculado con un sistema que causó esas pandemias. Por eso cambiaron de foco, no un foco en la geografía absoluta, los coordinatos, es que cambiaron a un foco estructural, y eso es la geografía relacional, cómo los factores en algún sector del mundo se trasladan a otro para crear una pandemia o para crear el medio ambiente que también conlleva a patógenos que se llevan a los seres humanos como maldad.
Okay, I'm wondering now whether, given the time, we should start taking questions from the audience.
Sure, we can help with that. We have a few questions, and you know, we have received them a lot about for Rob to be answered, but also Joe, if you also want to pitch in, we'd really appreciate that. The first question, and again, we're going to follow the translation rules, is that I will set a question and Joe will translate it and then answer in English and then in Spanish. So the first question is actually a combination of two different questions we received. One of them is from Stephen Eisenman and Barry Weisletter. So to put the questions together, they're asking, is animal agriculture always or sometimes the mediator between the original host species and human populations for such zoonotic viruses? And also how, what would it take in terms of political strategy to put an end to deforestation, or better reversing it, you know, to prevent such forms of spillover of these viruses?
Yeah, those good questions. I mean,
Rob,
sorry, my apologies. Go ahead, Joel.
Okay. La primera pregunta que tenemos de la audiencia son dos preguntas parecidas. Primeramente, quisiera saber sobre el vínculo entre los seres humanos y la transmisión de las maldades. Y también, Nafis, the second part of the question?
The second part of the question is, what would it take in terms of political strategy to prevent spillover of such viruses through animals?
Y también, qué va a ser necesario en términos de la estrategia de política para prevenir que existe este derrame de las maldades desde los animales hasta los seres humanos.
I'll try to make it brief. So all zoonoses, those are viruses from circulate among animals. Those are the sources of human diseases for the most part. Although you have, different types of animals have different types of diseases, birds, bats, and the like. And the way we as society organize ourselves changes the exposures to the different types of animals. So early on in civilization, when we went sessile and grouped into towns, we did two things. One, we started raising livestock and poultry, so their diseases were more likely to infect us, but also we were in a greater concentration. So we were better able to support more acute infections that last only a couple days, but could be deadly. Yes, I see the comment, human infections can go back into humans as well. That is absolutely correct. We are part of a integrated ecology that does that. Now, how do we intervene is that the problem is that when a capitalist sees a forest, it is of no value unless it's just a bunch of logs. So you, in essence, have a world system organized by sociopaths who basically would rather, in essence, would rather turn Earth into Mars and into a Dust Bowl if it involved making a buck. So you have to stop that. And that's hard work because they have the power and the money and the guns. But we are at an existentialist crossroads. We are at a historical moment that was going to require us to remove the levers out of their hands, because otherwise they'd be perfectly happy running down the ecology to nothing and leading to the death, not only of our other species, but our own. So I counsel students, I say, it's not your fault, and it's awful, and it's not your fault, but you're now pressed in the moment to have to get your hands on the wheel and push back. I'm certainly up for transitional demands in the sense of maybe there's some reformist things we can do. Rich people aren't going to let that go. There's a saying that you defeat them when they're running for their lives. CLR James. It's not, that involves a considerable sense of understanding of where we are. And it's going to require a resolve and preparation for what that necessitates. You can read between the lines. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, como contesta, explica Rob que la zoonosis, que es la virus que uno contagia de los animales, es la fuente que, de donde vienen los virus que tenemos como seres humanos. Claro que existen diferentes tipos de los murciélagos, de los pájaros, pero de todos modos eso es algo que habla de cómo la sociedad se organiza, porque eso cambia cómo estamos expuestos a esas viruses y la zoonosis. Históricamente, cuando nosotros como seres humanos se mudaban a los pueblos, eso causó varias cosas. La primera, una gran concentración de gente. La segunda, eso nos causó las infecciones agudas. Y también eso nos acercó a los animales como los pollos, que también fue algo más atado al concepto de la zoonosis y cómo podemos trasladar los patógenos de estos animales a los seres humanos. De todos modos, también explique, Rob, que en ese momento estamos experimentando una crisis existencial. Dice que cuando un capitalista vea un bosque, solamente lo entiende si se ve el bosque como troncos. En ese momento estamos viviendo en un mundo que es un sistema organizado por los sociópatas. Entonces, es una cuestión de posiblemente hacer unos cambios reformistas. También menciona la frase de C.L.R. James, puede tropezarlos cuando están corriendo para sus vidas. Entonces, explica que en ese momento es importante que damos cuenta de que los capitalistas también están causando esa clase de problema.
Thanks, Joel. Joe, would you like to make a comment, or we can also move on to the next question?
Go ahead and move on to the next question. You know, if I have like short comments, I just put them in the chat. If I have something
I loved your
major to
marshmallow
say,
comment.
yeah,
by the
but
way.
yeah, it's true. But
Yeah, I didn't know that squids could do that, but that's interesting. Okay, so the next question is from Betty Levine. They're asking, is there pandemic research for the people providing information on sites of possible transmission? As for example, comparison of different conditions on public transportation, surfaces, etc. So I think, Rob, if you could give us a little bit more details on what PrEP have been doing or their methodology and something similar, that would be appreciated.
Yeah, I'll make it brief. On the PrEP website, prepthepeople.net.
Could we let Joel translate that?
Sorry, my
No,
apologies.
that's okay. No worries.
Y la siguiente pregunta es si existen las investigaciones sobre los sitios de transmisión, por ejemplo, en los medios de transporte público.
Just briefly, our focus is largely on how the political economy impacts many of the problems that people face in rural and urban communities. So it's about organizing people to get the resources they need. We haven't been focusing on more technical kind of questions that you've been asking. One of the things that at the beginning, we were concerned about things like that. So we were thinking about, well, how do we get some access to PPE? Because at that point, there wasn't any. And then we read about the union's effort to try to obtain some extra ones, and they were, in essence, scammed. So our focus became more about the broader picture of how, supply lines are shaped by capitalist refusals to do XYZ. So our vision is that the day-to-day interventions are things that everyday people can work together to figure out. And our interventions are more about the bigger picture of how can we learn to organize ourselves in a way that we can get to that point when such specific questions can be answered.
Sí, en ese momento no estamos exactamente enfocados en esas preguntas técnicas que mencionaste. Nuestro enfoque es cómo la economía política afecta a la gente en las comunidades rurales y urbanas. Más inicialmente, o mejor dicho, al inicio de la pandemia, un enfoque fue que la gente cotidiana no pudo conseguir el equipo protectivo. Y también cuando los sindicatos intentaron conseguir eso para sus miembros, también ellos fueron sometidos a las mentiras y de nuevo no llegó a la gente cotidiana lo que necesitaban para protegerse. Entonces eso fue algo de una intervención, y las intervenciones cotidianas que hacemos y nuestra visión es más sobre el dibujo grande de cómo se puedan la gente cotidiana organizarse en contra de esa economía política que conlleva esos problemas, y después queremos poder enfocarnos en esos asuntos más técnicos que mencionaste.
Nafis, I do have a comment I want to make. This is a struggle that has to be engaged at multiple levels. Rob is absolutely correct that I think one of the most important things we have to do is engage people to take control of their lives and their situation. But at the same time, people like myself who are professional scientists, we have an obligation to give people accurate scientific information. And I'll give you two examples of work that my research group is trying to do. One, we're trying to start sequencing as many samples of the COVID virus as possible. And we've already collected samples from wastewater along the North Carolina A&T campus at several sites. And we want to sequence them because we really don't know what the genetic variation landscape of this virus looks like inside of people. And so the new variants that have been discovered from South Africa, Brazil, the UK, now one in California, think of it this way, that's the tip of the iceberg. But there's much more below the surface and we simply don't know about. And so unless we do that work, we can be easily overwhelmed by more resistant and more dangerous variants. That's one thing that my group is trying to do. Of course, they're not funding it yet because, as Rob has pointed out, capitalists really aren't that interested in saving the lives of Black and brown people. Second point, the science behind how one actually builds antimicrobial substances is fundamentally flawed, in part because the people doing the work don't understand evolution. So I just spent the last year writing a book called Antimicrobial Nanomaterials, Principles and Applications, to explain to these people how you could actually build sustainable antimicrobials. But again, there's a huge capitalist industry-related group who only want to do things quickly so that they can create a product that they can put on the market, even though the science shows that their product can't possibly work. And so again, we need to be doing this at all levels. So I try to call people to where their skill set is, where they're located in the community, where they're located in the place of production, because you can struggle at every single aspect of this beast, and we need to.
Lo que explica Joe es un comentario mostrando que es importante atacar ese problema en múltiples niveles. Explica que como cientista profesional es importante y es necesario que los cientistas proporcionan la información que es más adecuada. Explica que en su laboratorio en ese momento están estudiando las muestras de la COVID que sacaron de la costa de Carolina del Norte. Y eso es para descubrir lo que será el ambiente o entender la genética de la virus. Los variantes que han llegado de Sudáfrica, de Brasil, de California, solamente son parte de lo que es una ola enorme. También, como segundo ejemplo, dice que es muy importante estudiar cómo unos que son capitalistas tienen su industria de solamente priorizar crear un producto que lamentablemente no funciona porque no tienen como prioridad un entendimiento de la evolución. Y también muestra que eso es algo que está atado al capitalismo y que todavía está haciendo este trabajo sin recursos porque lamentablemente no existe tanto empeño para ayudar a las comunidades negras y morenas.
Thank you, Joel, and obviously Joe and Rob. So in the interest of time, I think the next question we're sort of going to also make it work as your concluding remarks, Rob, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
Okay, so it's a mix of a couple of different questions, but all sort of pointing towards the same thing. The folks are asking how climate catastrophe is influencing the spread of infectious diseases, and how can agroecology, as compared to eco-modernism, help mitigate both these dual crises of global climate injustice and pandemics. Joel?
Okay. Oh, sorry, Joel, go ahead.
And agroecology and, I'm sorry, Nafis?
Let me repeat the question again. So could you say more about how climate catastrophe is influencing the spread of infectious diseases, and how agroecology, as compared to eco-modernism, can help mitigate both these dual crises of global climate injustice and pandemics?
Okay. Una pregunta sobre las catástrofes de la clima y cómo eso conlleva las pandemias. Y una pregunta para Rob para platicar sobre cómo la agroecología y también la justicia de clima pueden juntos ayudar contra esos asuntos de la pandemia y de las virus.
Yeah, you know, the public health works by virtue of developing systems that can deal with a certain level of predictability or risk or unpredictability. And what climate change is doing is what it's doing on the global level, what the agribusiness is doing from region to region, which is it's unplugging ecological relationships and replugging them in new ways, in such a way that previously marginalized pathogens suddenly have an opening that they didn't have before. So there's very much part of that. It's also tied in together with the kind of land grabbing involved, the climate migration that's being forced on millions of people, that leads to the kind of increase in vulnerability to outbreaks, decline in the capacity of societies to support large concentrations of people. As far as solutions to that, I am a proponent, and this is written up in the book. We detail the difference between agroecology and eco-modernism. Agroecology views agriculture as a means of of solving many of these problems. So, you know, returning agriculture into a natural economy rather than industrial economy basically says that the agriculture isn't just the crop or the animal that's raised, that it's the greater landscape, and that we need to do the things necessary to allow the kind of, to use a reductionist term, the ecosystem services that landscapes provide: clean water, rich soils, all those things we need to work at to allow nature to do the things necessary to grow, help us grow food. The eco-modernist approach is we can make machines to do all that. Instead of eating livestock, we could eat lab meat. And these are, in essence, greenwashing the very system that led to the damage in the first place. There's a strong left contingent that's in favor of eco-modernism. You know, in some ways, we might agree that, yeah, vaccines should be used and protected, but it really is, in essence, the kind of, the problem is that the means of production, the actual modes of production, are foundationally related to the relations of production. And what I mean by that is that the machines that we use are in part reflecting and means of enforcing the ownership relations that are involved in this. So there's a reason why, you know, the Luddites smashed the machine. It wasn't because they were opposed to machines. They were opposed to the system that basically used the machines to rob them of their land and their right to do their work on their terms, their locus of control. And so moving forward, big picture, and this is my wrap up here, a way out of it is, in essence, agroecology. It's about getting back to developmental parity between global north and global south. The global north has used the global south as both as its refrigerator and its toilet for hundreds of years and left millions of dead annually there. So the damage was concentrated around the equator. But this is what pandemics and climate change represent. They represent that damage there is now everywhere. So if you want to stop that, then stop destroying the global south. So it involves, you know, getting control back into the hands of the peoples who are growing the food in such a way, and not destroying the landscape and ecologies upon which our very species depends. So that involves peoples around the world starting to work together. And there's a farmer I know who basically put it this way, that it's going to take internationalism to defeat globalization. So we're going to have to start reaching out to our brothers and sisters around the world in terms of working through how we get this political system, economic system, how do we defeat it and replace it with something that puts humanity back into its ecological position as part of a larger ecosphere, rather than the kind of Promethean domination that is leading to the end of civilization as we know it.
En contesta a esa pregunta, explica Rob que la solución simple será el internacionalismo contra el globalismo. Eso es poniendo el control o devolviendo el control en las manos de la gente que están creciendo nuestra comida y sus medio ambientes. También eso involucra una variedad developmental entre el norte global y el sur global. En esos momentos y históricamente, el norte global ha utilizado el sur global como su retrete, como su baño. y también ha tenido comportamientos y políticas que en ese momento están destrozando el sur global. También hablando de la agroecología y el ecomodernismo, la estrategia de agroecología es una economía natural. En contra del ecomodernismo, quisiera nada más hacer una máquina y también hacer lo que se llama greenwashing la idea de mostrarse como una persona que está a favor de lo que necesita la tierra, pero con propósitos capitalistas. Menciona como ejemplo que los luditos destrozaron a las máquinas porque esas máquinas representaron un sistema que amenazaron su vida y el locus o el enfoque del control. No solamente son las máquinas que utilizamos, sino las relaciones que reflejan del sistema en donde vivimos.
Thank you, Rob, for those powerful words. And thank you, everybody, for attending. Joe, did you want to put in a few last words?
My only last words is that I was amazed at how much I concurred with Rob's analysis in Dead Epidemiologists. I mean, I've not seen the argument made so clearly before. So I'm going to encourage everyone, if you've not read this book, you need to read this book.
Thank you very much, Joe. I appreciate that.
Como su último comentario, quisiera decir yo que realmente fue sorprendido en cuanto está a favor y en cuanto él está al mismo lado que los comentarios presentados en el libro de Rob.
Great, thank you. So thank you everybody for sticking with us for this extra 10 minutes. And thank you again for attending. Thank you to Rob, to Joe, and thank you to our co-hosts, Monthly Review Press, the publisher of Rob's book, Dead Epidemiologist. Rebecca will be posting links in the chat where you can follow our co-sponsors, and also you can buy a copy from Pilsen Community Books. Seen some comments about supporting your local bookstore. Pilsen Community Books is an amazing bookstore in Chicago, and they ship across the US. Also, shout out to DSA Eco-Socialists who are organizing for passing the PRO Act, which will help the labor movement grow back to its power, hopefully. And again, feel free to join Science for the People if you want to get involved. Links will be in the comment. Again, thank you, everybody. Hope you all have a good weekend.
Thanks a lot, Joe. I appreciate it. It was good meeting you.
Nice to meet you as well, Rob. We should talk sometime.
We should. So we'll be in touch.
All right.